ethics. Okay, here it goes. So at the edges of empathy, journalistic ethics of translation in Sarah Glidden'S Rolling Blackouts. I would like to go into screen sharing mode and show you some of the slides that I have for this presentation. So you'll see me as a small head offering a commentary. Okay, there we are. I just try to move this a little bit and switch to large screens. Here. Fumbling as usual. Okay, there you go. Perfect. So here we are. Yeah. So welcome to the next module. Oh, sorry. This is something that shouldn't happen. Okay. This I don't know why this is happening. We have a glitch. Sorry. Okay, so I won't be touching anything because these slides have embedded audio, but I'm going to do the audio live for you, of course. So, so looking at the genre of comics journalism, by focusing on one particular example, Sarah Glidden'S Rolling Blackouts, published in 2016, it allows me to examine some issues around journalistic ethics and translation, especially in engaging traumatic, catastrophic events of others. So I think it's really interesting to talk about those issues today because we witness daily the new laws of journalistic standards and ethics, fake news, sensationalism, political biases, reducing information to simplified sound bites. So the fact that journalism has been turned into an ideological battlefield of ideas and a piece of the market as well, it gets worse when it comes to sharing global news. And we see that the daily spectacle of the US election fallout, for instance. So this is all made worse by unequal power dynamics, guilt, cultural ignorance that are often involved in conveying news from the global south to the global north. Before I sorry, there you go. Before I look at Glidden'S text, I would like to say a few words about comics journalism. And one of my absolutely favorite comics journalists is Joe Sacco, one of the pioneers of this form of sequential art that covers non-fiction topics. And such topics can include real-life events, reporting from war zones, conflict zones, all kinds of analysis of complicated geopolitical situation, but also investigative journalism, travel, reportage, biography, coverage of social movements, and even scientific news. So as sequential art, comics uses a combination of words and images. And this form of graphic journalism is actually supposed to be at its all-time peak nowadays. That's what some people claim. And it also includes a popular and widespread web comics, right? In fact, Glidden'S book, before it was published, it was serialized on her website. And that's how also a lot of other comics journalism books have been produced. For example, Josh Neufeld's acclaimed reportage from New Orleans, post-Katrina New Orleans after the deluge, also originated in the form of comics blogs initially. Now, this form, this genre, has its old roots in political cartooning, and even in other forms of pictorial representation of news events. For example, there are engravings that have been commissioned to represent the events of the Civil War in the US. But unlike cartoons or comic strips or engravings, a series of engravings, it is nowadays often published as a self-contained book, and it's research-based, it's using interviews, and it's relying extensively on historical sources and primary, and also, as I said, the secondary sources. So here is the cover of Glidden'S book, Rolling Blackouts, Dispatches from Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. I hope to be able to use this text to reflect on the tangled relationship between journalistic ethics, vulnerability, and transnational empathy, as well as the role of multiple mediations that are involved in conveying the news from the global south to the global north in particular. So in that sense, it can be useful to think about the aporias of cross-cultural contact from above, from the perspective of the global north, which is sort of like oscillating between the two extremes of cultural imperialism and assimilation, sort of like enrichment, taking an enrichment approach that you can see in how translation travels, for example. On the other extreme is the aporia of untranslatability, like reducing the other to the totally unknowable and untranslatable, constructing the irreducible foreignness of the other. So Rolling Blackouts, as I said, published 2016, goes back to the early events, so there are like two time frames. It deals with the aftermath of the 2003 war in Iraq and in the refugee crisis that followed. Now, those topics that the book deals with have become ever more relevant since the Syrian war. And it addresses all kinds of institutionalized violence, not directly, but it brings the consequences of those forms of violence to the forefront, talking about, militarized violence, state-sanctioned violence, fueled by global capitalist greed for oil, and by nationalist and ethnic divides in the region. So we witness daily new lows of journalism. Oh, sorry, again, we have the audio, which we don't want here. Okay. Sorry. As okay. I said. You can hear the recordings. I'm so sorry. Okay. I feel like I'm moving the cursor and accidentally activating the audio embedded in the slides. But anyway, so there are multiple vulnerable bodies that you see in those slides. And they include different groups of refugees in Syria, Turkey, and Iraq in this case. But also the vulnerable bodies are the bodies of the journalists who often put themselves in harm's way. What this book is a meta critique of the journalistic engagement with the war crisis. So as a meta critique, what it does, it questions practices, it questions methods used in performing in comics journalism or journalistic investigative journalism as such. So it reflects on the very act of doing something, asking questions about how are we doing it? Is my ethics in doing it sound? Are the principles we base our practice on good? So here you have a reflection of an ethics of transcultural encounter that the text sort of like performatively enacts as Glidden travels with her companions through the region, and as she's shadowing a group of journalists who are her friends. I just want to add that this book has become a mandatory reading in some journalism courses, and is used as a sort of manual in some American programs in journalism, because it lays bare the nuts and bolts of journalistic reporting, offering definitions of and perspectives on journalism that are equally passionate as sometimes they are sobering with regard to revealing its limitations and constraints. And I will partly address this later. Sorry. Here we go.
As I said, Sarah
This is
has never...
so annoying. I'm sorry. I guess it turns it on automatically now. Okay, so what you see here are two Sarahs. One is Sarah Glidden, the one wearing the black top. The other one is Sarah Studeville. So Glidden has never done comics journalism before, but she embeds with a group of independent journalists, and she accompanies her friend Sarah Studeville and photographer Alex Stonehill on their trip through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq that they made in 2010, so a few years after the war. So in 2005, Studeville and Stonehill, together with another friend who worked for nonprofit, had established a multimedia collective called the Seattle Globalist. So this is an organization of independent journalists. Their mission was to, and I quote from the book, to do reporting on issues that were being ignored by the mainstream media. So in the book, Glidden reproduces multiple situations of shop talk and relies a lot on the journalist lingo. And we see Studeville and the photographer Alex interviewing different people. Even on the cover, you can see the setup for a photo shoot. We see Glidden interviewing the interviewees or the interviewers. But in most cases, Glidden herself is a discrete presence in the frame. She is Sarah Studeville's faithful shadow. So in addition to soliciting a definition of journalism, both Sarahs are also talking about the project, about its rationale, about its constraints, and its interest values. So there's this constant commentary in the book. Glidden is invited to sit in on editorial meetings, listening to and recording the conversations, and participating in situations where decisions about the project's further direction decisions are taken. So, okay.
On this trip,
I think I should have removed those. I see now that I should have removed those audio slides and used another version here, but that's all I have right now, so we have to. So, what Glidden documents on this trip, and here you can see Sarah Studeville making comments about journalism. So a good journalist doesn't go into a story already knowing the conclusion. People never say the stuff you want them to say, and the revelation that happens is never the revelation you're expecting. So she's offering, mostly Sarah Studeville is focalizing a particular kind of journalistic ethics that Glidden faithfully records and reproduces, and not really challenges that much, although there are moments when she challenges it, and I'll show it later. Now, Studeville says that she believes that journalism is based on the idea that if people are exposed to more ideas and information, then they will allow themselves to question things that they assumed were right. So journalism as a sort of like, a consciousness raising form, maybe, inspiring also dissent, and independent thinking. So as Glidden documents her friend's pursuit of the material that Studeville thinks is interesting and should reach American audiences, right? You can say that this goal, that perspective, is inspired by the liberal hope that freedom of information matters, and that sharing stories could help. A post-colonial scholar, Gillian Whitlock, actually describes it in this way, that sharing stories might help to engage a witnessing public and engender compassion, mobilize shame, and inspire campaigns for social justice on refugees' behalf, right? So that's Whitlock in Post-Colonial Life Narratives. But for Glidden, that trip was primarily an opportunity to make a comics about how journalism works. So she includes all those nitty-gritty aspects of the profession, such as finding interviewers. Okay, this is moving on its own now. I don't know why. Sorry. Okay, let's see where we are. I don't know what happened here. Sorry, guys. I am way too far. Okay. And we were still here, right? Okay, let's stay there. So finding interviewers, finding translators, finding fixers, and also reflecting on journalism's role in the contemporary world, and especially in the current conflicts. So they interview officials, civilians, refugees. They collect testimonies that have the potential to connect to American publics and inspire empathy, as Whitlock anticipates, and possibly even move people to action. But one aspect that is fascinating, that interests me, that is not directly addressed in Glidden's book, is the issue of translation, right? I think comics have the ability to show these multiple mediations, which are often invisibilized and obscured in global news, because comics uses image, and it's a graphic medium. So what is invisible in the global news transmission can be made visible in comics. So if you consider journalism itself as a translational practice that involves multiple mediations, some are visible, others are not, and some are deliberately and obscured and falsified, we need to consider the ethics of translation and journalism maybe together. So they share specific concerns about issues such as accountability or fidelity to the source, the issue of transparency, even the question of translatability, the question of truth, the question of equivalence. And of course, translation also involves the question of affinity or empathy for the source, right? These two books that I put here are just two examples of scholarship done on journalism and translation, and it's only started relatively recently. As you can see, one of the earlier texts was 2009, Bielsa and Bassnett's book, Translation in Global News. And more recently, there is this edition, Journalism and Translation in the Era of Convergence. So in reporting from conflict zones in particular, this translational ethics is even more tangled, and the invisibility of translation becomes even more problematic. Those of you who are in translation studies may recall two strategies used by translators, and these are, almost like cliches. One strategy is foreignizing, that is, leaving visible the traces of foreignness in a translated text, and thus openly revealing its status as mediated or translated news. The other is domesticating, meaning totally erasing any traces of foreignness and mediation or translation from the target text. So it makes the consumption of the news, the consumption of the translated text, much easier for the target audience. And it is telling that in a news translation, the dominant strategy is, you guessed, domestication, right? Almost absolute domestication. The material that you see on the news is shaped in order to be consumed by the target audience. So it has to be tailored to suit the needs and expectations of the target audience. So as a result, what the audiences don't realize is that we are reacting to global news information and statements that are in fact provided through multiple translations. Bielsa and Bassnett note an almost complete lack of attention to translation and how it is employed in the cross-cultural transfer of news. They show that international journalists conceive of translation in ways that are very different from linguists or translation studies scholars. So when information passes between cultures through news agencies, it is not only translated from one language to another, but it is also edited, it's reshaped, it's synthesized, and it's transformed for an easier consumption by the new audience. So what I mentioned earlier, traditional ethics of fidelity, equivalency, accuracy, and translatability and transparency, which is understood as immediate access to truth and meaning, unfiltered through linguistic, cultural, and ideological mediations, doesn't apply mostly, in most cases, for translation operating in the global media world, global media market. So the media constructs news stories, and their global transmission requires processing, requires editing, reviewing, rewriting, repackaging, molding, and so on. So that, as a result, there is no distinction between source and target in this kind of transmission, or it's less meaningful. So rather than faithful reproduction, translation in the context of global news is deliberate and conscious selection, right? It's like an assemblage or assembling, excuse me, even fabrication in many cases, if you think about, what we're watching on Fox News. This also is addressed, okay, and here I need to stop this, right? This brings us back to Glidden and to the question of moral ambiguity of journalism, which is really centered in her conversation with Stuten. So Glidden recognizes the limitations of idealistic expectations from journalism in the era of globalization, post-coloniality, and new conflicts and neoliberalism, when the field of global news is kind of like characterized by the market dominance. Here's a conversation that one of the shop talks, that the hard part about journalism from a moral standpoint is that the journalists have to make choices. And quite often those choices are motivated by the market and its logic of commercialization, what can sell, what is newsworthy. And it's also shaped by competition, who comes up with a better story, and surveillance. Not all stories make it into the public. So this kind of practice, journalistic practice, involves constant negotiations, including decisions what to omit and what to highlight, how to shape the material, how to make it marketable. So there is this self-consciousness reflected by the journalist workshopping here. This is a conversation about refugee stories here. So people spend a lot of time telling you how they feel and what happened to them, and you can't even guarantee that it's going to go anywhere, right? So this is the aspect of the job connected to marketing. You have to figure out how to market these stories to people who will be interested. So Stoutville, who's a seasoned journalist, connects this to moral ambiguity of journalism. And she sees that moral ambiguity in pitching relevant human interest stories to editors who may be reluctant to show those stories because they don't want to overwhelm their audience with stories that are too depressing, as she says. So there are all those factors that are taken into consideration when assembling or news stories. How newsworthy the story is depends on its timing, on the global region where it originates, on the ideological position of the newspaper or news agency, and other constraints, availability of images, and so on and so on. So, in other words, those decisions, translational decisions involved in journalism, are always imbricated with power inequalities, and they operate as this double-edged technology of knowledge production. On the one hand, they can open up new channels of understanding and communication, but equally well, they can reinforce the status quo and reify existing geopolitical structures of domination. No, this one is quiet. Okay. There is another angle. No, wouldn't give us this. Sorry. So I hope it will stay quiet. Ouch. Must be irritating, I can imagine. Okay, so there's another angle to this question of accountability that Studeville wants to explore during this trip. She brings along her childhood friend, Dan O'Brien, whom you can see here, who is an ex-Marine who actually was in Iraq in 2003. So she wants to create an additional story about a Marine's return, a vet's return to Iraq. So throughout the book, Glidden witnesses interviews between Studeville and Dan, as well as Dan's interactions with local people who have, well, quite mixed reactions to him. And Studeville hopes that the journey will bring about Dan's opening, some transformation, some revelation about his experiences and emotions related to his service in Iraq. So this is her hidden agenda to provoke him to recognize the consequences of the invasion of Iraq and to complicate also the issue of American civil responsibility for not stopping the war. So here is again one of those interviews, the conversation between Studeville and Dan. So as a result, Studeville constantly wrestles with her ethically questionable use of Dan in the hope of witnessing his catharsis, and which would make for a good story, of course. While she's collecting her material, Dan is expected to post his own blog from the trip. However, Dan's position does not really shift. And Studeville's comment on his posted blog ironically resonates with her own prying, while also speaking to the challenges of being confronted with too many unknowns. She says here, right? It becomes really complicated to find that good narrative and explore it without becoming completely paralyzed by all the things you don't know and can't relate to. Okay, where's my...
So here you see...
Sorry. Okay. There you go. Quiet. So then here is voicing this sentiment. He's really resisting Studeville's pressure to even reflect on his own involvement and participation in that. This is trying to go to the next one.
Interestingly, when Studeville is...
Okay, there you go. So this is Dan posting his blog, and Sarah Studeville and the photographer, of course, Alex, trying to nudge him to push further, to do more, inviting him to do something more with his video blogs, right? And maybe comment on how Iraqis are responding to him, how the war affected people on the ground. So she actually says here something that she herself practices in her journalism. She says, I think this could be made stronger by acknowledging what we can't know. I think that would help in infusing a little more balance into it, which I think, is what you are going for here anyway. So she's kind of like trying to flatter him. But the question of showing what you don't know, that is an interesting question. And it's a stance that you could say is probably, I mean, you could see it as trying to avoid epistemic violence being imposition of one narrative only. Like Dan is consistently imposing his own narrative. Studeville is trying to mitigate that in her own reportage by revealing what you don't know, what the journalist can know. So this, according to her, actually strengthens the reported stories by injecting some balance into them, allowing her to hold what she refers to as a moral center of the story.
Glidden shows.
Okay. Sorry, not there. I didn't realize it could be such a problem with those files, audio files. Anyways, apologies for that. So this wrestling with moral ambiguity is literally visible throughout the whole trip, documented in the book. Not only on the personal level, the journalist's engagement with the interviewees and the subject matter, but also even this moral ambiguity is kind of like duplicating the one on the geopolitical level. And the book opens with a graphic epigraph, which is composed of 8 panels. I'm only showing you 6 here, but they are quoted from the story inside the text that describes the journalist's visit to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Center in Douma, Syria, in December 2010. And here you can see the American journalists are confronted by an Iraqi refugee woman in a red hijab who is torn between her willingness to have her invisible plight witnessed by a larger public, and on the other hand, her distrust of the American government, the ambivalence that is triggered in her when she learns about her interlocutor's national identity. So in each panel, the woman stutters, she's stuttering, and she's attempting to articulate her conflicted emotions around sharing her story with people whose army had ruined her life. So she encapsulates this dilemma faced by the journalists themselves, how to deal ethically with the refugee crisis in the Middle East as the fallout of the conflict that was created by the US. So this is just one such example here, but some other.
I described.
Okay, there you go.
I
don't describe anything, sorry. I'm just gonna, there, okay. So embedded journalism, that's another interesting issue that Studeville is talking about, and of course Glidden is reproducing here. So Studeville quite often strategizes and improvises topics on the go, and one of those topics that she's fascinated about is the problem of embedded journalism. And here you can see Studeville with her colleague, locally based, Sebastian Meyer, who opened an agency with the local Iraqi partner, Kamran. They are discussing the ethics of embedding. Now, Meyer, who used to be an embedded journalist during the Iraq War, doesn't see any problem with that. And Studeville, again, is trying to prod him to think about, for instance, how much self-censoring is involved in being an embedded journalist, in particular because journalists form friendships and alliances with the soldiers with whom they are embedded. Now, of course, the phenomenon of embedded journalism is familiar, and you can think about, for instance,
as I mentioned, you can look up.
Okay, yeah. Judith Butler.
As I mentioned.
Oh, okay. So Judith Butler has written a piece for the PMLA on photography, war, and outrage, and she's talking about embedded reporting, which, as you remember, it emerged into public view with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it's defined here as the situation in which journalists agree to report only from the perspective established by military and governmental authorities, right? They traveled only on certain tracks, looked only at certain scenes, and relayed home only images and narratives of certain kinds of action. So it was, embedded reporting was like a mandated way of seeing. And it was actively involved in transmitting the perspective of war. Now, so it is a form of framing, a form of filtering the information, indeed a form of censoring at the source that Student's friend, the journalist who participated in it, denies.
So what is brought under?
Okay, there we go. Turn it off. So ultimately, what gets formulated during this trip, during this process, is a minimal set of ethical standards for journalism that is articulated here in that sequence of panels by Stoutville rather. Be informative, be verifiable, be accountable, be independent. And well, you can think about Fox or CNN if you want in the context of this. But I want to suggest that these are, these expectations are tested in journalist encounters on the ground with their informants, fixers, officials, news agencies, politicians, and so on, but often under challenging conditions and at personal risks. Now, how sufficient, how useful they are, what aspects are missing from this code of ethics? Of course, we need to ask those questions. You can see that this minimal code of journalistic ethics is grounded in a liberal ethics of individual responsibility, accountability, as you can see here, professionalism and personal autonomy. And this ethics may not be universally shared, but especially under the conditions of war, extreme poverty, and collective trauma. And it's put to a test in.
Okay, so here we are taking a short break.
Sorry. I just want to put it here for people who actually are, I don't know if they are present here. Martha was going to bring her class here, but people who draw comics journalism, I suggest here that you can refer or compare that minimalist ethics that Stoutville articulates in Glidden'S book to Blake Nelson's instructional article on the site, on the online magazine Pointer. And the Pointer is a online publication of the Pointer Institute for Media Studies, which is a non-profit journalism institution, and whose website says that it champions freedom of expression, civil dialogue, and compelling journalism that helps citizens participate in healthy democracy. So again, it's steeped in the values of the global North. But here, it's interesting when you look at it from the point of view of a practitioner, that Nelson focuses on issues such as formatting, aesthetic issues, ethical questions, even the minute decisions that are involved in drawing comics journalism, because he's aware that, for instance, how you draw the face of the person, the source's facial expression, can artificially manipulate how a certain quote is interpreted and how the reader relates to the source that appears in comics journalism. The other issue, of course, is also, what we know about the particular conflict that or situation that is being covered, visual details that need to be supplied, and that's the question of how much is invented in comics journalism. What are comics journalists allowed to invent? So this is a more like practitioner focused view of as opposed to the abstract set of values that.
So going back to
okay. No, that not yet. In Glidden'S book. So going back to this book again, Studeville's ethics is, as I said, based on a set of abstract values. And her loyalty is primarily to her audiences, to her readers. So she's all about old school objectivity, adamant about not making any promises to desperate, unfortunate, sometimes, really needy people whom she and her colleagues interview in different locations. And one such case is particularly jarring, is the case of Sam Malkandi, a refugee who was deported from the US on immigration charges, which were totally unsubstantiated. After 5 years, spending 5 years in the US detention facility, and he was separated from his wife and children. But Sarah Studeville, reporting on it, is extremely cautious when receiving this story, and comments that it is important to tell people interviewing, first of all, tell Sam that this interview may not change anything in his situation and his family situation. But at the same time, it's very cautious around the veracity of his story. While there is this aspect, on the other hand, she is also meticulous in historical contextualizing and documenting the facts before covering any topic. So she can demonstrate the ropes of shooting a reportage to Glidden, things, for instance, such as capturing an interviewee on tape. The crew shoots some B-rolls, as they are called, again, using the journalist lingo, which so everyday things that are not going to be in the interview, but maybe can be used partially to humanize the subject. So that kind of like connects to what Nelson was talking about. Like you have the journalists and graphic journalists have a way of manipulating the response of the audience to, arouse their empathy. So in the course of Glidden's shadowing of her friend's project and her conversations, this meta-critique of journalism is elaborated, right? What this meta-critique and the demand for a special ethics of journalism calls for, it demands acknowledging US complicity in causing the problem in the Middle East. It demands revealing limitations of one's knowledge and understanding, and accepting that some questions will have to remain unanswered. So in a way, it's embodying being an incomplete witness. It also entails providing historical contextualizing, political contextualizing, and refusing to speak for, so reproducing dialogue and oral, through oral history interviews, and for grounding multiple mediations that comics can do. So those mediations that are foregrounded, they concern translation, which is my last, okay. I hope it's quiet. All right. So here is one image where you can see how translation, how mediations, especially such as translation, are foregrounded. So there are all those intermediaries brokering a view from below, from the ground. Sometimes there are local people who can speak English, recruited on the ground.
Glidden's book is very good at.
At other times, there are translators who may be used via Skype. So in this case, you can see the journalists are in Van in Turkey. They interview Iranian refugees, including Amin, a refugee blogger, and his wife, but they are using this convoluted communicative chain with English translation coming from Germany via Skype. And you can see the voice here from the computer. So the Farsi English translator is present via Skype, and his voice is coming from the computer screen, adding a further layer of distance to his already filtered he says and she says. So each translation is preceded he says, she says, so transparency is removed. Sometimes translation is visualized in the frame by means of superimposed speech balloons, ensuring that the figure of the refugee is never immediately present, never immediately available to the reader. So there's this distancing device. And this is a way of problematizing non-transparency in translation, right? Sometimes there has to be signal, and it's also in other parts of the book, that the translator is also providing like information that constitutes embedded reporting. So in Syria, the Syrian government, for instance, assigns a public, a government employee, a translator, so who is also their unofficial minder, right? So the Syrian government makes sure that in this way it can control the content of the interviews that these particular journalists will be doing in Syria. So despite all those mediations, the book still manages to convey the commonalities of refugee experiences of dislocation, loss, uncertainty, economic hardship, and insecurity. So, and here is an example.
Translators.
Okay, here's an example of translation within the frame of the comics. How comics, as I said, is a medium that has the ability to foreground. Oh, we only have 10 minutes left, so I have to ready. So this is a very interesting case of the translator Kamran, whom I mentioned earlier, and Kamran, the translator, is an Iraqi photojournalist himself, who's also translator or who interprets stories of Kurdish refugees stranded in Iraqi Kurdistan. And actually his role here, his demeanor, casts heavy doubt on the ethics of journalism that is governed by the right to know and the duty to report from an objective distance that Studeville represents. So it juxtaposes with Kamran's ethical responsibility and obligation to intervene and help. So what he does, he sort of like, during this conversation, he discovers that the subject, the interviewee, complains about extreme cold in the camp, in the refugee camp, and asks for a heater. Now, Studeville always keeps the boundaries intact and relies on the principle of personal disengagement. Now, Kamran interrupts this convention of objectivity and politicizes the roles of journalists by inserting himself in between the interviewers and the desperate refugees with the promise that the reporters will talk to someone who helps or offers them some hope. And his final gesture of buying a heater for the family in the internally displaced persons camp also embodies his ethics of refusing to abdicate personal responsibility and action on behalf of those who suffer next to us. And the final,
so here we are.
Okay, the final slide,
So
yes. The final slide is actually from the back cover of the book. And I just want to use it quickly, 1 minute, to show that there is a certain ambiguity also in terms of, empathy. And, Glidden'S comics ultimately invites us to consider the limits of this transnational empathy that is generated through graphic representation. So a British feminist, Caroline Pedwell, is talking about effective translations in the times of neoliberalism. So she's talking about empathy as a neoliberal technology of containment, and empathy, the other kind of empathy, as a potential openness to being affected and transformed by the other. Now, in comics journalism, the issue of awakening the reader's empathy, as I said, is not free from ambivalence. In here, you can see that empathy can be a goal in itself, as an end point, providing a sense of feeling good, but not really being able to influence the decisions on the geopolitical, political scale. So here, in Glidden'S case, the ability to be moved translates into donating money to a progressive cause. I'm not saying it's not important, but again, it is an individualistic, privatized response. So empathy is more likely here to remain the purview of those who are already socially privileged and who can buy Glidden'S book and who can donate money in support of the Iraqi student project, as she encourages us to in the final panel here. Okay, I think I'm going to stop sharing and go back to you. And I apologize for the glitches and for the, I know we have hardly any time left, but maybe we can get some comments or questions from people before we wrap up.
Eva?
Yeah.
Well, I'll start. Thank you for sharing this material with us really just very quickly, because it resonates so well with what we're doing in the Theorizing Cultural Translation class today. And one of the readings we're doing is Françoise Lyonnais translating grief from, I mean, your work is so much more contemporary, and there's been so much more done on empathy that I think points out the ambivalences, and you do such a good job of that. But what I was really struck by was the stuttering of the red hijab. And one of the things she points to in her reading of it's a West Africa, or it's Maryse Condé's first novel. But the question of what stuttering can do and how it can work affectively. And she draws a lot on Deleuze for that in his very short texts about stuttering. And so I thought that this was really, it raises so many questions about how stuttering opens up in language space for, you know, interventions and things. But of course, it's very striking. You're dealing much more with this visual medium. And so I wondered if you had anything that we were thinking about how stuttering works in images.
Yeah, I think that this is actually a wonderful detail that you picked on in this, you know, presentation, whatever. I haven't had time to go deeply into it, but I also consider the book in the context of trauma comics, right? Yes, so stuttering, not here, but stuttering is a form of fragmented speech, right? Stunted speech, it's embodiment that cannot communicate, right? And in the context of trauma, there's been so much published works on trauma comics and the particular suitability of comics to communicate trauma because of their fragmented character, right? That it is the sequential art, but it is also fragmented. So it doesn't offer like an overriding continuous story. It is itself stuttering, right? And the work of meaning making, according to Scott McCloud, a famous comics theorist, happens in the gutter, in between. So it's like, you know, in a way, comics also stutter, and the reader has to process them in the spaces of the gutter, kind of like, you know, reconstructing experiences or narratives that are already fragmented, that are in pieces, that are in traces, right?
And so that actually, if I'll just have a really quick follow-up, because I don't want to, and I know our time is short, but that's so interesting to rethink what Deleuze is doing in terms of being much more affirmative and positive by saying it's about language itself stuttering. And I just wonder, that seems like there's something you can do sort of as a way of rethinking also the negativity of trauma by thinking about that there's something actually very, very productive in the formal quality of comics.
Absolutely.
Visuality that you're arguing. That's really fascinating. Thank you.
I think those things connect very well, right? And that also goes back to the issue of epistemic violence, right? I mean, any narrative of a seamless kind of story, seamless narrative language itself, verbalizing, interpreting, this is already inscribed within that. I mean, this is an extreme horizon of epistemic violence, but we know that the insufficiency, the incommensurability, right, of language, as you say, language already, as you're quoting Deleuze, already stutters, right? So that's, but precisely the fascinating thing is about finding like a visual equivalent, and the medium itself communicates those issues so vividly.
Hi, Eva.
Yes.
Can I pop in here? So thank you. That was wonderful. I wanted to maybe just talk to the 4 ethical points of journalism that she raises. And obviously she does think about translation because she puts it in the book, and she has these very tense moments between, you know, what's really being translated and, you know, what's really being communicated. Yet in the ethical points, she doesn't put representation as, being representative as one of the ethical points of journalism. And I'm wondering, do you have any sense for why this is she just finding it too difficult a topic to be able to put into a comic book, or does she maybe not think through higher ethical dilemma?
You mean Glidden, right? Because I'm thinking there are like two levels, right? Two filters.
Yeah.
One is Glidden, one is Studeville. So
Right.
the journalistic ethics that is being filtered through Glidden is not necessarily Glidden's own, right?
Oh, okay.
And in a way, because it's kind of like, her protagonist is Studeville, is this paragon of moral journalism for her. At least, that's how the relationship between Glidden and Studeville is very interesting. They are friends, but also Studeville assumes the role of Glidden's mentor, right? So Glidden, who's never done any comics journalism before, is learning from Studeville, learning the ropes, and also figuring out, how to share what she has learned with others, with her readers, viewers, right? Through her blog first, and then through this book. But I feel that there are certain ironies that happen, that Glidden is a little bit ahead of Studeville with, Studeville's kind of minimalist ethics, as I call it, because it requires being problematized. So, by for instance, bringing in that, and she leaves it, she actually, there's a very interesting conversation that follows that visit where Kamran decides to buy a heater. And it's not Studeville is out of the picture, and it's Glidden who is questioning Kamran. So are you going to buy a heater for this person, for this man? So this is like, providing like another, like a meta commentary on Studeville's, on the limitations of Studeville's approach. Representation, it's not directly addressed here, right? But there are certain little snippets here and there. And even what I said earlier about shooting B-rolls, for instance, ensuring that the interviewees are represented, are humanized, are represented through their own voices, through their own, daily experiences even. So there is some thought along the way given to how to ethically represent people whom we encounter, right? But it is all within those boundaries that are the boundaries imposed by the profession. So the issue of the profession, so there's an interesting thing, something pushes against that professionalized approach to journalism that Studeville and her colleagues embody. And Glidden's narrative is sort of like in between that, and captures the limitations and the kind of like, aporias, if you want, of those professional ethics that they try so hard to perform and embody in front of her. So yeah, I say there is some stuff on representation as well, unless you meant something different by representation.
No, that's that, and the fact that there isn't this focus on real representation of the subject. It's really more representing the subject to the audience, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, there is there's a double remove there. She never steps in to represent the interviews. She never messes up with Studeville's work, really. If there is direct representation for the audience, it includes herself and her interactions with others, really. But even then, she's quite often on the sidelines, in just with listening to what's going on and recording.
Hi, can I ask a question? It's Martha here.
Hi.
Sorry for being late.
No worries. Yeah.
I'm at the hospital right now with my mother, but
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to follow up on that kind of question, because you were talking about the embedded journalist, right? And I'm not sure if there's like a double embedding here with Sarah Glidden embedded with the journalist, like taking on that Studeville's ethical points, right? So she sort of has to, in a way, maintain that. Because I was wondering if, throughout the book, if she ever really does start to reflect on, her position as a drawer.
Right.
If she's really focused on journalism itself and kind of maintain some kind of neutrality in just documenting. Because in the introduction in text, she points out that she, and she draws it too, that she's carefully transcribing, and she did record all of the conversations and interviews. So is she not kind of believing in this kind of neutrality? And does she end up taking a position on the graphic aspect of what she's doing?
Right. No, thank you so much, Martha, for this observation. I think that you've already said it all. There is double embedding here for sure, right? I mean, she is embedded, and I use that word deliberately. In a way, she is also unremarkably, I mean, also I would say she's remarkably unself-conscious, right? As a recorder, as an appointed chronicler of this trip, because that's what she effectively is, right? She's shadowing, accompanying, and taking notes and drawings in her notebook and chronicling every step of the way. But you are right, as much as she, it is a self-reflexive comics, because but this reflexivity is applied to journalism. It is not applied to comics journalism, right? So this is something else in a way. What I said is that there are some unintentional ironies, some unintentional revelations, where Glidden is maybe a little bit shyly, but taken a view which is different from Studeville, different from the group with which she's embedded. But she finds ways of, transmitting it, not in a direct, kind of confrontational way, but through quiet juxtaposition. Like, I see one of those very prominent examples is her kind of like siding with Cameron on the issue of buying a heater for the deprived, family in the displaced people's camp. So yeah, I mean, this is remarkable. But she also takes second, back seat, right? I mean, she doesn't want to put this at the forefront. For her, it's about journalism, and it's like a manual how to do reporting. So that's her scoop, is to be able to witness. And in this way, in a way, you could say that as much as it is about journalism, so it's like a double, situation here, which reminds me a little bit of Scott McCloud's comics about comics, right? So she is effectively performing comics journalism, that is, Glidden is, by taking journalism as the subject of her comics. So it's a little bit like, different there. But that's what I can say right now. Maybe it has to be thought over more.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you for the comments in the chat as well. Is there any other question? Because I know I feel bad because I've been keeping you longer than intended.
Oh, Ava, let me do a plug for you and put in the chat. I forgot where we can get the recording because I was looking it up while you were speaking. So I'll just copy it in for you, and then everyone will be able
Thank you.
to, at least I'll try. And here it goes. Let's see if I can put this in here. So this is where you could find out about the other talks coming up as well. And this is where Aunt Priska will post your
too.
Looking forward to seeing it. Thanks so much. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you all for coming. And I really appreciate, you being here. And,
yes, thank you, Ava. It was wonderful.
And apologies for the glitches. I know that it cannot be cleaned from the recording. It's a bit of my self-consciousness that's going to be preserved for viewers. Anyways, thank you so much. Bye.
Okay. Thank you.